astrology is what got me into Bitcoin. So I was like a Bitcoin astrologer and still am. And so I love thinking about Bitcoin time cycles and thinking about Bitcoin in that kind of like time-centered way. And that's essentially what Ordinals is. Ordinals essentially looks at Bitcoin as, okay, the first block was mined on January 3rd, 2009. That's sat 0, ordinal number 0. And then you just enumerate sats from 0 to 2.1 quadrillion, trillion, however many there's going to be in 2140.
Blockmates Orange is sponsored by Core Network, the ultimate Bitcoin-powered EVM-compatible blockchain. Learn more about Core at blockmates.com.
Cool, we're back. Welcome back, everyone. Blockmates Orange got a super cool guest today. Apparently, she can talk more than me, so hold on to your horses. Erin Redwing, welcome. Bitcoiner, artist, podcaster, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, exactly. It's a podcaster on another podcast. So it's just going to be, we could go for like 3 hours if we wanted to.
Yeah. So just for those of you who don't know, and obviously part of the intro is Erin's a co-host on a podcast called How Money, probably one of the coolest names for a podcast, and also one of the coolest and most edgy podcasts I've watched in a while. She co-hosts with probably one of the craziest guys I've come across in the space. Tell us about How.Money and how that came about, and what was the main motivation behind that?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So my co-host is Casey Rodomore, who's infamous in Bitcoin, but really shouldn't be. Like he came up with ordinals and runes, but he's kind of the most like to the book Bitcoin maxi that I've ever met. And yeah, we started the podcast way before ordinals. I like to say like my biggest talent was that like I scouted Casey. Like I think when I started the podcast with Casey, he had maybe around like 600 followers on Twitter. He was known by people in Bitcoin because he goes to a lot of meetups. We're both in the Bay Area. The Bay Area has a really, really active Bitcoin meetup group. I highly recommend if you live somewhere with a like Bitcoin meetup group that you go because they're awesome. But yeah, we met at a Bay Area Bitcoiners meetup. I was sort of trying to come up with a podcast idea for a while. I wanted to do something in Bitcoin. I didn't feel like there was a lot of content that fit me. There's kind of a lot of the what is money, Austrian economics perspective on Bitcoin. But there's not like a lot of Bitcoin vibes podcasts. That's really what I was trying to make, was a Bitcoin vibes podcast. And when I met Casey, I just thought like, wow, this guy's an incredible speaker. He knows Bitcoin so thoroughly, really mostly on the technical side of things. I mean, he's a dev. So I just thought he was really like the right person to have a podcast with. And then it turned out that we also just had this really insane chemistry that if you watch the show, it's just like an extremely deranged piece of media. So we did the podcast for like 8 months with literally 100 viewers, like it was just, and I think in that time I gained like 5 years of Bitcoin education just because I was essentially getting like a private tutoring session with someone who knows Bitcoin very, very well. And then after about 8 months of the podcast, he had been working on ordinals the whole time. We talk about ordinals a little bit like in that 8-month period. But we did not expect it to literally have the overnight takeoff that it had. And that was January 2023. So yeah, we kept recording the podcast, but then added a bunch of other new things, like I quit my day job and went full-time in ordinals about a year later, January 2024. And yeah, now I'm just like a weirdo project crypto Bitcoin person. And we're still doing the podcast and it's still just as deranged. So that's kind of how that came to be.
Cool. How many episodes? Do you know how many episodes you guys have done?
I think we've done like almost 60. I think it's like 56 or 57. How many episodes have you done?
I have no idea. we've got quite a few. I mean, we've got Blockmates Orange, we've got Blockmates TV. I don't actually know. It's like it's been over 4 years. I don't know. I should check. I mean, I knew you were
Yeah, there
gonna
was a
ask.
period
I
of
knew you were gonna
time.
ask me a random
I mean,
question.
you set me up. You set me up.
But you knew
We
the
were
answer.
recording once a week for a while, and now we record every other week because there's just
Yeah.
too
Okay.
much going on. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah, we
mean,
got to do something. We
I
got to do
think.
something for like our 100th episode. You know,
Yeah,
it's
you got to do. Absolutely, you must do something.
yeah,
So I mean, in terms of the kind of like the whole money, is there kind of like anything beyond that? I mean, do you guys organize events, do all that kind of stuff? I know that there was talk. You guys are going to Token 2049 next week. Eh? You do have something on. Okay. So what have
yeah.
you got? What have you got planned for that?
Yeah, I organize a bunch of events. I'll say like Casey doesn't do anything that he doesn't absolutely 100% want to do. That's like just kind of the way that he rolls. So he writes code and he records the podcast and he doesn't even respond to messages if you try to DM him. Like
Yeah.
he won't. So yeah, Casey kind of just like does his crazy tech artist thing, and I end up doing a lot of the other stuff that we do either together or just that he shows up to. And one of those things is events. I mean, I think like as I said, I met Casey at an in-person meetup. I think in-person meetups are, I would say they're necessary in the
Yeah.
digital age that we're entering into. Like at this point, between like everyone's anon profiles, it's really, really hard to know who you're meeting and who you're talking to. And beyond just like, oh, in person things are fun and it's very invigorating and inspiring, like all those things are true. But also I think just on a practical level, like you need to meet the people that you're working with. And
Yeah.
especially if you're all over the world, it just like it's good to have excuses to meet up.
Yeah.
And so we've done three conferences now. We did Inscribing Amsterdam was our first one. That was at like Bitcoin Amsterdam 2023, which was in October 2023. Then we did a conference at Miami Art Basel because obviously Ordinals is kind of in that, art Web3. It's in a lot of different Venn diagram intersections. So Art Basel is kind of a natural place to put it. We did an event there, and then we did another one, Inscribing Nashville, for the Bitcoin 2024 conference in Nashville back in July. So yeah, and now we're doing Singapore. So we have Inscribing
Cool.
Singapore next week. It's like Tuesday of next week, September 17th. We're doing Art Basel again in December. So we've got like a whole lineup. But yeah, really, I think like, as I said before, I really felt like there was a lacking in Bitcoin vibes content, whether that was like
Mm,
podcasting events, whatever. And so that's also kind of what I do with the events is I try to curate speakers that I think are interesting, that have something to say, and not just have it be, an opportunity for everyone to be like, yay, I get to speak at an event. That means I'm important. That's
yeah.
always how it goes, right? So
Yeah.
I think if we can actually have interesting conversations and allow people the opportunity to meet each other, I feel like it's just a necessary part of an evolving like digital ecosystem.
Yeah. So I mean, you've got quite a what I enjoy about your take on things is that it's quite practical and it's also philosophical. Like we did chat a bit about the philosophical aspect of the way that you perceive Bitcoin, but we'll get into that. We'll kind of like leave that as a dangling carrot for the listeners. But I wanted to just quickly like just cover the ordinal side of things. I don't want to get into too much about what Casey's done because I think what Casey's done is quite extraordinary around ordinals and that wave of interest that we did get. I actually more wanted to get your take on it as someone that was sitting in the room and kind of like watching this thing unfold. Because as far as everyone concerned, NFTs are like dead in the water. I mean, I disagree with that. I think it's quite naive to think that in light specifically of what's happened with ordinals. And I wanted to just get your thoughts around, firstly, that experience and watching it unfold, and then your thoughts around, obviously, your work in the space from an artist's perspective and where you think it's going. And it's always good to have a cat on board. Um,
Right, exactly. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, firstly, I think like the thing about ordinals that's interesting is it's essentially just a different lens through which to look at Bitcoin. And when you unlock that lens, that's what unlocks the potential to inscribe content on it and to make those like NFTs. But I think like ordinal theory is a really interesting thing. So that's what Casey was working on for quite a while. That was I mean, really, like, that was the hard thing to crack, was to get ordinal theory working, make sure there were no holes, make sure it made sense. Um, and then, of course, you have to do the development around like how to actually form the Bitcoin transaction to put the arbitrary content in the transaction that ends up being the NFT that's tracked by the ordinal. But what I loved about ordinal theory is that it's essentially like observing the natural time cycles of Bitcoin. So I, this is the whole other rabbit hole, but astrology is what got me into Bitcoin. So I was like a Bitcoin astrologer and still am. And so I love thinking about Bitcoin time cycles and thinking about Bitcoin in that kind of like time centered way. And that's essentially what Ordinals is. Ordinals essentially looks at Bitcoin as, okay, the first block was mined on January 3rd, 2009. That's sat zero, ordinal number zero. And then you just enumerate sats from zero to 2.1 quadrillion, trillion, however many there's going to be in 2140. And, that's a really simple idea. It's a really simple, like, sat tracking algorithm. And then you can kind of derive interesting meaning, which people have with rare sats.
Yes.
Um, which come in the form of like, okay, well, maybe the first sat in every block is special. Maybe that's something that's interesting. And so every block we get what's called an uncommon sat, and it's just observing that like very small time cycle of Bitcoin, which is just like the creation of new sats with every new block. And then, you can extrapolate that out. So like the difficulty adjustment is another time cycle in Bitcoin
Yeah.
that happens every 2016 blocks, or approximately every 2 weeks. So maybe that sat of that difficulty adjustment block is also kind of special. And then you could look at the halvening, right? And you can even look at the conjunction of the halvening and the difficulty adjustment, which happens for the first time in 2032. We're still so early.
Yeah.
So it's just like a really, from someone who thinks that way in terms of like ascribing meaning to time cycles and observing time cycles. It's essentially just a lens through which to view Bitcoin time cycles, and it's just really elegant and nice. And that was the thing that I always really liked about Ordinals, was just like it. It doesn't feel like Casey invented it. It feels like he discovered it, and he just was in the right place at the right time to build it out. And so, yeah, he was working on that for a long time. I always thought it was really cool because, I enjoyed that part of it. And I never really would have expected that it would take off the way that it did. Not that I didn't think people would be into it. To be honest, I thought the people that would be into it would be Bitcoin maxis, that were like,
And
wow,
quite
Bitcoin is
quite
so
the opposite
cool.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah, so it definitely didn't happen the way I thought it would. I knew people would like it, right? As I said, it was interesting actually. The fact that it was so hated by Bitcoin maxis actually definitely propelled it to success, because if you give a lot of attention to something that otherwise wouldn't be getting attention, people are going to look at it and use it just because of that, right? So
Yeah.
in some ways I feel like maybe that reaction actually led to its success more than it would have if it was just like a bunch of Bitcoin maxis being like, yeah, it's so cool, Bitcoin time cycles, because people really focused on that NFT aspect of it, which then
Yes.
drew in this whole crowd of people that would care about that, right? um but yeah, I don't know, I think like NFTs are kind of lame on other chains. Personally, like, I was never an
Mm.
NFT person. I know that collectibles and art and degenning and whatever you want to call it is popular. I'd never doubted that aspect of it, but I wasn't personally super interested in it. The thing that's interesting to me about ordinals is that, well, I would consider myself like a Bitcoin maxi. Like, I love Bitcoin. That's really my primary focus. Um, and I think the fact that we can inscribe cultural content onto Bitcoin and leave that mark on Bitcoin is really, really significant. Like, it's uncensorable. It's permanent in a way that our human lives are not permanent, and it's cool. Like, if you had the opportunity to make your mark on the pyramids of Egypt, like, wouldn't you do that? I mean, some people wouldn't, right? Some people would be like, no, this is a sacred thing that should be unmarked. But I think, if you have the opportunity to essentially inscribe your legacy, make your mark on history, kind of document something about culture, history, philosophy, whatever it is that you think is interesting, your own art, you know, you can put that on something that I think will outlive all of us. And that opportunity is just, it's crazy, and it's a lot to wrap your mind around. So that's kind of like the way that I've come to understand ordinals through all of this. You know, I have a lot of thoughts on the ecosystem, the reactions of people, whatever, but that's like my personal take on it, is like, this is an opportunity to do something really cool and to like inscribe something that means something to you. And so, yeah, do it, you know, why not? And think about it that way. Think about it with that level of permanence.
I mean, I think your comparison on the pyramids is quite valid, especially if it was in real time, and you had the opportunity to maybe go and put a pebble in that pyramid as kind of like your. I don't think you really are tarnishing the sacredness of it, or even to kind of like put your fingerprint on the outside of the pyramid that remains permanent. I think in many ways it adds to it, and I think it's in line with what you say. You're actually adding to something that ultimately was for the collective as opposed to the individual. I mean, that's what Satoshi Nakamoto created it for. It was for,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
I mean,
That's the point too. Like, we are
yeah,
in this era where decentralization is the focus, right?
mm,
That's like a key difference between the pyramids of Egypt and Bitcoin. In both cases, you know, future archaeologists will look back at them and be like, how did they move those blocks? I don't understand. How did they have the technology? You know, like there's that's the same between the two, but the main difference is that, like, you know, we are building Bitcoin in a very decentralized, permissionless way, which was
mm,
not the case for the pyramids or any mega structure of the past. So like that's part of it too, right? Is that like it's not any one hierarchical authority's job to say this is what Bitcoin is going to be, this is what the design is, this is what the construction will look like. It's a decentralized process. And
yeah,
so yeah, like that's, it's not even really like graffitiing in the sense that there's no like thing that is the important thing that you're then making your mark on. Like the whole thing is all the graffiti. That's the point
yeah.
of it. And so I also feel like that's even a necessary part of like what makes Bitcoin the structure of like the digital decentralized age. You know, it's being
Mm,
constructed in that style that's almost like the artistic style of it, you know?
absolutely. I mean, for my favorite part about Bitcoin is the fact that it's the most powerful and relevant network that humans have ever built. And you've got an interesting kind of like perspective. It's not even a theory, it's like a perspective around how, as a species, we mark our presence through time. And your whole thing, obviously, around kind of like the time and the stamps that are the ordinals is bigger than that, right? So you perceiving it. So yeah, just give us the rundown in terms of how you perceive Bitcoin as
Yeah.
not just kind of like a network, but something that's a lot more permanent.
Totally. Yeah. So I mean, I think if you look back at every past advanced civilization, they all leave behind a mega structure that outlives them. The pyramids are a great example. You know, we've talked about that already. But you can literally look at anywhere, whether it's in like Central or South America, you know, in Turkey, wherever you see these, they're usually big rock structures that last even when everything else has gone to complete ruin. And those are the things that we look back on in order to try to understand the civilization that no longer exists, that we don't have written documents from, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we're obviously in a huge transition civilizationally right now, right? Like, I mean, the internet is it's changing everything about the structure of the earth, the structure of the way that we connect with people. And I think we're in this period right now where we're building out essentially a digital civilization. And people think that the internet is written in ink, but it's really not, right? Like, try to go back to your MySpace page from 10 plus years ago, and you have to use the Wayback Machine, and there's only some screen caps, and then they get lost and whatever. You know, it's really, it's not a permanent record.
Mm,
And I think Bitcoin is essentially primed to be the perfect primary source document of the digital civilization that we're building right now. And so I use the phrase Bitcoin is the digital megalith to try to communicate that, because what I mean by that is, like, if we look at all these megalithic structures from the past, I think Bitcoin is the digital equivalent of that. And there's a couple reasons for that. So one is that it's a mega structure, right? It's a huge, huge file that, anyone who's run a Bitcoin core node or has mined Bitcoin has to download Bitcoin in its entirety, which means you have to download literally every single transaction and every inscription now too, right?
Yeah.
So it's a extensive document, both of economic transactions as well as now like cultural artifacts that everyone has to download whenever they use Bitcoin. And so I think it's probably one of the most, if not the most, extensive, both in terms of content and in terms of where it's downloaded all around the world. So like if you think about like that from an archaeological perspective, like imagine that eventually our civilization will go to ruin or we'll lose a lot of artifacts from our digital civilization. Bitcoin is self-replicating. Like anyone who wants to run Bitcoin has to like re-download it. So it kind of like has that preservation aspect to it while also having all of this deep, deep content in it. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think Bitcoin essentially will be the document that is used to understand digital civilization in the same way that we use megastructures that are all around the world to understand past civilizations. And so that's like the way that I try to think about inscribing, and
Yeah.
yeah, the making graffiti on the pyramids of Giza or whatever you want to call it, like it's an opportunity for us to almost think of it like a time capsule, to think about like what would you want to communicate to someone who's essentially an alien to us now, right? Whether those are literal aliens
Yeah.
or just future archaeologists that have no context to understand us. Um, and like a lot of the projects that I end up working on, like kind of come around that thesis of just like trying to think about Bitcoin from the perspective of thousands of years in the future after our civilization has risen and fallen, and to try to make those marks that will essentially allow for that like Da Vinci Code kind of like archaeological experience of like piecing together like when did this exist? What did they mean? Did they worship this frog? Why do they have this Pepe all over? Was this their god? Like all these kind of things that I think, you know, if you imagine yourself thousands of years in the future trying to understand Bitcoin, like leaving those hints now for that, essentially. That's like what I try to do. And yeah, I think honestly if Bitcoiners thought about inscriptions through that lens,
Yeah.
they would like them a little bit more. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's reverence for Bitcoin. It's like a reverence for how important Bitcoin already is and will be in the future,
Yeah.
And yeah, I think why not? Why not try to like make your mark and communicate something, some sort of personal or societal truth through Bitcoin to the future.
I mean, obviously, there's this kind of like there's a limitation, right, in terms of the amount of information that you can put. But then the irony of it is that if we do arrive at a point, which I'm pretty confident we will, where Bitcoin does become kind of like that medium of exchange or that medium of value, that it obviously has the potential to kind of like transcend in all aspects. And I suppose that's kind of like the writing on the network or writing on the wall. It depends on how you interpret it. I mean, obviously, there's the whole idea that there's intrinsic value in Bitcoin in terms of like the price in US dollars, and I kind of find that amusing as well. And I think maybe there's a discussion around that, and I'm sure you guys have chatted about it as well. Is like, why do we actually like look at a chart and actually like base value of Bitcoin on a US dollar value when in fact doesn't it transcend that? But then do we arrive in the future? Like, so the question is eventually, like, do we arrive at a point in the future? And your thoughts around this is that does Bitcoin ever become the value of one Bitcoin because it is this network that transcends all other networks and allows us in a digital age to actually conduct ourselves in the manner that you are like have described, obviously in a philosophical sense, but in a practical sense. I don't know if the question makes like does the question add up around what it is that I'm trying to establish here?
Yeah, no, I think that part of it is like the necessary prerequisite for everything that I'm saying. Like,
Yeah,
you need an incentive to run a node in the first place, right? Or to
correct.
mine Bitcoin in the
Yeah,
first place in order for this like digital megalith theory to play out. And so that's why like I didn't, it took me like over a year to kind of like connect the pieces to like get the idea of like, oh, if this works, then that means this
Yes.
being the digital megalith theory. Like, I think that the reason why Bitcoin works is primarily the simplicity of the tech and then the kind of macroeconomic thesis that emerges from the tech itself. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have I have a lot of thoughts about like, the US dollar and fiat currency and all of
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And I think like it's interesting that, you were saying like why do we look at the price of Bitcoin US dollars, or like at what point do we kind of think one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin? I feel like Bitcoin price is useful because it's essentially like the best metric for currency devaluation. Like that's really what it tracks.
good
Obviously, there's an
good
element of
answer.
like
That's a good answer.
adoption,
Yeah,
but that's what it is. It's like the
yeah,
money printer turns on and then Bitcoin price goes up. And whereas other assets, like you maybe see inflation in other ways, or maybe it's, you have like the CPI index, which has all of its fucking problems. And, Bitcoin is not entirely just
yeah,
a money printer tracker. Obviously, there's something to be said for people adopting it, people demanding use of the network that like drives the price action as well. But like, just track it with money printing. Like
yeah.
it's essentially one to one, And so
Mm,
I feel like it's more right now, you know, I feel bad for people that have no contextual understanding of fiat, because I think it's very confusing for them to live in the world right now. Like that was at least my experience. Like before I understood what fiat was, what happened in 1971, all those kind of like, classic Bitcoin maxi macro econ talking points. I just didn't understand why money felt so fake,
yeah,
and I think there's a lot of people who feel that way, but they don't have the knowledge to articulate why money is fake or what exactly is happening. Like, why is the stock market so divorced from economic reality? It's yeah, it's a shame that people don't understand that fiat is like a relatively recent experiment that we're doing. Like we weren't always just printing money and going into debt infinitely. And I feel like Bitcoin, the price of Bitcoin, and just the way that I would see it as like an outsider of like, oh my God, this thing went from zero to now it's $60,000 for one, and it's just fake internet money. Like, why did this happen? It's like you're observing something that's actually tracking the devaluation of currency. And there's nothing else really, maybe you could say housing prices, like, real estate. There's other assets that maybe track that. But I think Bitcoin most directly points it out, right? That's like the thesis of Bitcoin, is to point that
mm,
out. And so I feel like it's the best metric for understanding like the absurdity of fiat and the way that we're just completely devaluing the dollar. It's
yeah,
so yeah, number going to go up as long as fiat clown world is going to continue, I think is essentially what we're looking at. And maybe at some point, we look at Bitcoin as one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin because the fiat currency system has just gotten so ridiculous that it doesn't make sense to compare Bitcoin to it in a way.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I was listening to something quite recently where I'm not 100% sure on the numbers exactly, but it was kind of like it took the US 200 years to get to a $1 trillion deficit, and then another 50 years to get another trillion, and then it all went south, where another 30 trillion basically happened over a space of like several years. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thumbs up to that.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's kind of like the serious side to it, and obviously Bitcoin has a serious side to it. I mean, I had a really cool call and this morning with Herman from Bitcoin Ecasi. I don't know if you're familiar with what they're doing, but it's
No,
essentially
no.
like it's a South African local crew who have essentially gone and found money from the Bitcoin Beach guys in El Salvador. So there's a donor that's essentially allowed for adoption and the rest of it. And in South Africa we've got people that literally live in the ghetto here, like very third world, very very poor. But what Herman and his team have done is that they've gone into this area that he's in and kind of like educated store owners, like shop owners, around Bitcoin, not only as a medium of exchange, but recently also as a medium, as a savings account. And there's been this huge movement around how, like, they've taken on Bitcoin and people now pay them in Bitcoin. They pay for supply in Bitcoin. And there's this whole circular economy that's happening. And the point that I wanted to illustrate is that this is the kind of thing that puts into play the exact thing that you've been talking about, like from a legacy, like from a legacy into the future kind of stuff, like if we are transacting on the most meaningful level where people actually do separate state from money, and it's kind of like, well, I don't need a bank, I don't need the government, I can do this on my own, I can supply people with food, I can make money out of it, and I can save. That's how we get to this point, I believe, because that's where it starts and that's where it takes off. When you look at Africa, for
Hmm.
example, there's a lot of like despondency around the fact that people can't get banked, people can't get access to essentially what Bitcoin can offer them, and it's a great story waiting to be told. So yeah, I agree with you. I think what you talk about is very relevant, and I think Africa has a big part to play in that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
no, absolutely. I mean, I think there's certain groups that are primed to adopt a Bitcoin circular economy or adopt Bitcoin as currency more than others.
yeah,
Yeah, anyone who's disenfranchised by like the current fiat hegemonic system is obviously more primed to accept that narrative and to adopt something that benefits them. I mean, uh it's not as like interesting from like a moral or ethical perspective, but Ordinals essentially functions as a Bitcoin circular economy as well,
mm,
right? Like um and it's a similar group where it's like crypto people or NFT people are probably a lot more primed to use Bitcoin in their daily lives than like the average person in America or any other, like major first world country, because they're already doing it. And instead they were just doing it on other chains, like they were buying and selling art, JPEGs, whatever you want to call it, for Ethereum or for Tezos or for Solana. And now they're doing it on Bitcoin. And so, like, if you look at the way that Ordinals marketplaces work, it's literally all like just partially signed Bitcoin transactions between the buyer and the seller. There's no like centralized exchange that's collecting up all the ordinals and all the Bitcoin and then mediating that. It's peer to peer. And they're doing it all in Bitcoin. And like,
yeah,
I view it as like harm reduction, where it's like, these people would be collecting, currency, other cryptocurrencies instead. And now instead they're stacking sats, right? Like the degens are gonna degen. You can't stop them from doing that. It's what they want to do. But you can at least like supply the clean needle of Bitcoin, right? Like you can have it such that this is like a Bitcoin circular economy rather than an Ethereum circular economy or whatever other currency people are doing, NFTs or degenning on. And so like, yeah, I think it's also been interesting. I mean, being in Ordinals, like I pay everyone in Bitcoin and I get paid in Bitcoin, like the people that I work with. And that's a really crazy experience. It's an absolute nightmare working with like tax agencies and trying to like run a legitimate business. It really has like opened my eyes to how difficult it is to deal with regulations, even if you're trying to do it the right way and do everything by the book. It's like it's it's a nightmare. It's
yeah,
probably a nightmare even if you're not doing it on Bitcoin, to be honest. I think there's just like so much red tape and bureaucracy. But yeah, it's like, we're starting to see like a essentially an art market that is a Bitcoin circular economy with ordinals. And that's cool. Like that's adoption as well. And those people now have Bitcoin that then they're more likely to pay other people with Bitcoin with, and it's sure it's still participating in that like speculatory aspect, where it's like people buy Bitcoin or stack sats because they expect number to go up. There's elements of that in the ordinal stuff that's not the same if like you're talking about like someone in South Africa that's accepting it for goods and services, but it's the same effect, right? Where it's like you're using it as a medium of exchange in both cases rather than just like hitting the DCA button every week and stacking your sats and just like hoping that one day it takes off. Like I think this is part of it's part of making things actually happen in terms of like that medium of exchange aspect. And yeah, it's interesting to see it emerge, like
mm,
most of the transactions on Bitcoin right now are like ordinals or ordinals related transactions, because that's what's happening,
Yeah.
so it's interesting times.
What are your thoughts on runes?
I mean, I think it's like completely degenerate, but again, it's like a clean needle thing again, it's like
Yeah.
people want to speculate on tokens. I mean, really the reason why Casey made runes is because BRC20 was this token standard that came out in March 2023. So Ordinals kind of took off in January 2023, and then BRC20 followed a couple months later. And BRC20 was essentially is actually just a blog post, like just kind of like a spec, an idea of like this is how it could be done. And then a wallet, Unisat, implemented it, and then it kind of went crazy. But basically, it was just a way of doing tokens on inscriptions or on
Mm.
ordinals. Which, like, yeah, I'm not super interested in, but of course the gambling speculators are, and so it took off. And really, the problem with BRC20 is just, if you look at ordinals and inscriptions, like I would argue that ordinals and inscriptions are good for Bitcoin, not just
Yeah.
they're bringing users in, whatever. Like, I think it's good for the fee market. I don't think it represents a substantial increase in the total size of Bitcoin such that it's really limited. Like, we have the block size limits for a reason, right? Like, if we have full blocks, that's the point. I think the ideal is full blocks. So I would argue that ordinals and inscriptions are good for Bitcoin. They're not bad for Bitcoin. I wouldn't say the same about BRC20.
Okay.
And the reason for that is just like it encourages the creation of really small UTXOs. Like, it's just kind of like bad Bitcoin hygiene in a way.
Okay.
And so Casey basically just made runes to make it a UTXO based model instead of having it built on ordinals and inscriptions. Like, it was kind of arbitrary that it was built on ordinals and inscriptions. Didn't have to be. It just was sort of like, oh, this thing is happening, and now
Mm.
this thing is possible to kind of piggyback on this thing happening, and like not in a bad way. It's just that's the way that innovation works sometimes. Um, but yeah, it's not the most like efficient model essentially. And so Casey basically just made runes in order to allow the degens to do what they want to do, but to not hurt Bitcoin as they're doing it. So yeah, I don't know. Runes is funny because it's very simple. It's also not selling itself as anything but meme coins. I
Yeah.
think that's actually like, I would say my biggest moral apprehension to crypto is like the outright scamming, or kind of like the over promising and under delivering that often accompanies any, like, 99.999% of serious crypto projects. And Runes isn't pretending to be that at all.
Mm.
It's just letting the degens degen. And I think that's like a much more honest um, interpretation of what tokens end up being. So yeah, I'm not as like interested in runes. I think they're funny. I think it's like amusing that people degen on them, and it's the meme culture around them is funny. But yeah, I don't have there's no philosophical grand 1,000+ year narrative that I have about runes. I only feel that way about ordinals and inscriptions.
I'm of the belief that 99% of protocols shouldn't launch a token, and they should just focus on finding a product market fit. Because I think if you go back and actually observe a lot of these protocols that didn't succeed, I think most of the time they didn't succeed is because they launched a token and people extracted the value out of that protocol and they couldn't carry on doing what they needed to do. Um,
Yep.
and I
Yep.
think I think this is all an experiment. I think there's a lot of relevance here, but unfortunately, it's really difficult to distinguish where the relevance lies. I mean, I think the luxury that Bitcoin has is that it's been through trials and tribulations, and we found a new product market fit in digital gold. It was never
Mm-hmm.
designed for digital gold. I mean, it was designed as a peer-to-peer payment network, but we have found meaning in digital gold, and that's the nature of technology. It evolves. And I think tokens spoil that. Anyways, that's my little sermon around tokens. Even though I'm a DJ, I enjoy speculating and all that kind of stuff. I think I have a good understanding as to where it goes wrong. And I think it's all around the tokens. So there's a part of me that
Totally.
agrees with you. I think runes are cool because I see them almost as gateway opportunities, where people wouldn't have been interested in the whole idea of Bitcoin. I think they start looking at it a little bit more seriously. So I'm going to use that as an excuse, but I think it's a pretty good one in terms of bringing people's attention to, something that was quite boring up until, a year and a half ago. Not
Hmm.
bad boring, but it didn't really instill this imagination. I think inscriptions did that. So I want to chat about the next thing I want to chat about is obviously,
Well, let me add actually to
yeah,
your point
yeah,
quickly, because
go for
I
it.
agree with you, and I think actually like to the point of it being boring. I think like bringing some new excitement. It's not just for speculation. It's also like there's a lot of builders who didn't build on Bitcoin because a lot of the low hanging
Yeah,
fruit had been picked, and it was hard to build on Bitcoin. And now with runes and ordinals and inscriptions, there's this new crop of low hanging fruit where you can build, like a very simple infrastructure tool, like a wallet, right? Like you can build an ordinals wallet that has a use that didn't exist before. I mean, now there's lots, but right, like that's an example. You could build a runes aware wallet or an ordinals aware wallet. Whereas if you just wanted to build a Bitcoin wallet before all of this, like why would you do that, right? There's
yeah,
already Bitcoin wallets. So like it's not just that it brings in the speculators and it brings that like attention, it also brings easy first coding projects for developers that otherwise would develop on Ethereum or somewhere else. So it's like maybe you start by building a very simple thing that's related to runes and ordinals or whatever, but then you understand Bitcoin better and you understand how to build on Bitcoin better. And then I think there's like a lot of mind share, like dev mind share that was captured by other chains because there was just like more exciting building opportunities. So it's like,
yeah,
yeah, Bitcoin being boring wasn't just like for the speculators, it's also for people that like want to build something cool. And now there's like a lot of opportunities to build something cool, something that makes money, whatever on Bitcoin. And I think we're really like, we're only just now starting to see the effects from that, where it's like developers have started wrapping their mind around Bitcoin through building something through ordinals or runes, and now they're building something, even bigger than that, and like kind of building on Bitcoin as like a expertise.
yeah.
So yeah, it's also that aspect as well. But yeah, we can switch topics. I just wanted
Yeah,
to
yeah,
say
yeah.
that
Cool.
as
I mean,
well.
I totally like that because I mean, it's the other thing is just to add to that is that it actually it does it. I mean, the whole dev thing is obviously super important. I mean, that's like if you ask any ecosystem or any kind of like protocol, the main thing is like, do I have interest from other developers? And as soon as you have that, then it's kind of like that's the lightning in the bottle as far as I'm concerned,
Hmm.
and that's what's needed. I mean, I've always said that one of the biggest challenges Bitcoin has got is like, how do you motivate developers to stick around and actually make sure that this thing continues to evolve, even if you think it's boring, it still needs like good solid developers to come in and actually do positive things. But I want to chat about kind of your project and what you've been busy with from the art side of it. I mean, I think it's super cool. Um, I think the idea behind it is obviously very much in terms of who you are as a person, and tell us about it. The name is also great. So I'm going to let you do the intro. Imagine you introing this on your podcast.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, taking it back to the whole Bitcoin is the digital megalith thesis, right? Like if you think about Bitcoin as this primary source archaeological document or a time capsule or whatever you want to think of it, in order to just put yourself in the mindset of like trying to use Bitcoin as a way to communicate with people in the future, aliens, whatever, to understand our civilization, and thinking of it as this mega structure, like kind of going into that theory that all civilizations build these mega structures. Um, if you look back at past megastructures, they're almost always oriented along an astronomical axis. So, they either point towards the brightest star in the sky, or they're oriented along the equinoxes or the solstices or something like that. There's always like an astronomical orientation that's built into the building of the structure itself. And there's different, ideas for why this could be, right? Like it's just a natural thing to do, maybe, if you're an ancient civilization that had a full map of stars, above you, why wouldn't you build it along that star map? It's interesting, it's beautiful, but also it communicates the time in which you existed. And what I mean by that is, so the stars are basically like a solid map in the sky, but over long time periods, the map shifts slightly. And so, there's a couple different long-term processes, just in terms of stars moving around. There's also stuff like the precession of the equinoxes, which is just like the Earth moving on its axis a little bit. But with these kind of movements, we can look back at past megastructures and we can figure out when those civilizations existed, because we know that things have shifted over a period of time. So like, for example, maybe something was built such that the equinox was in one direction, but now we look at it and it's like a little bit off. And so we're like, oh, did they just miss the mark a little bit? Or was it that this shifted over thousands of years? And so we can actually use that to backtrack when that structure was built. It's an archaeological record in and of itself, that orientation that they built it on. And so if you kind of extrapolate that to the Bitcoin digital megalith idea, it seems obvious that we should try to do that for Bitcoin. We should try to orient Bitcoin along an astronomical axis. So that was kind of like the first thing that I started thinking about. And then I started getting into, okay, well, how does Bitcoin even like log time? We have our block timestamp, but like, what does that mean? Like, if you're trying to think about that from an archaeological perspective, like you see January 3rd, 2009 at blank UTC time, you actually don't even see that. You just see a timestamp, a timestamp that's based off of the beginning of like computer time in January 1st, 1970. So it's actually just a string of numbers. It's like the number of seconds since January 1st, 1970. It's meaningless, is my point. Like it's totally underivable from an outside perspective. But like, the motion of planetary objects is something that is derivable. Like you can just you can look outside right now and you can see, okay, the sun's over here, so it's about noon, or it's sunset, or the moon is here, it's a full moon, so that means it's this time in the monthly cycle, or the sun is here and that's this time of the year. Like you can use the planets to figure out what time it is I would say it's a decentralized timekeeping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
And Bitcoin is also a decentralized timekeeping mechanism. We all agree every single block, this is when the block happened, this is the timestamp, and that's a decentralized process, just like the order of transactions in a block is a decentralized agreement. But that timestamp is that's the problem, right? Like the timestamp is tricky. It's not super translatable, and so that's kind of like the flaw, in my opinion. So I wanted to essentially inscribe astronomical data, or you can think about it as astronomical timestamps, onto Bitcoin, in order to essentially orient Bitcoin along the astronomical axis of the time in which we're building it. So I think inscriptions are an easy way to do that, right? Like, you can just take the position of the planets, you can literally just inscribe it onto a sat. You can use that sat time for the time connection between the two, and then you're creating that artifact. So that was like the basic idea behind my project, which is called Ephemera. The name Ephemera is just because the planetary transits are called ephemeris data. The root ephemera, that root just means transitory, like it's a fleeting moment. That's why, like, if you collect like ticket stubs from concerts, that's called like ephemera, because it's like something that marked a moment in time for you, and it's just like a collectible. So I wanted to like play on that word. And also, planetary transits are called ephemeris data because the planets are always moving around. And so when you take a snapshot of the planets in one moment in time, that's like a very ephemeral like moment. And you can use that data to figure out what time things happened in. So essentially what I'm doing with Ephemera is basically we collected sats from every date in Bitcoin's history. There's a couple dates that are impossible. So like, for example, the first couple blocks we can't get. They never left Satoshi's wallet, so they're not in circulation. There's a couple dates like that, but it's a handful of dates, like less than 10. Other than that, we've collected sats from every single day since January 2009. And basically, if you go to ephemera.gallery, which is our website, you can select any date that you want. You can place a bid. We have it in like an auction style just to make it like fun,
Yeah.
like kind of have some sort of like gamified aspect to it. You select a date, you place a bid, and if your bid is in the top 16 dates every difficulty adjustment cycle, which is every 2 weeks, then we will inscribe that planetary data onto that sat from that date and we'll send it to you. And then it's like an ephemera, it's like a
Yes.
ticket stub, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like you're
Like your
collecting that
birthday,
memento.
so you can do can you do
Yeah.
your birthday, the time, or whatever the case is?
You can't do anything before 2009, right? Because that's the
Okay.
only, like when Bitcoin
Yeah, yeah,
started. So like a lot of people do like, the day they got married, the day their first kid was born.
yeah,
You can
yeah.
also do I mean, like people have done 420 dates. I think there's only two 420s left at this point. Like the 420 April 20th have been inscribed, like all of them.
That's
So you can do like
amazing.
meme
Yeah,
dates.
yeah,
Obviously you can do like interesting Bitcoin dates. That's another thing. Like people, block 9, which is like the oldest block in circulation, that was like one of the first kits that was inscribed. Yeah, it's basically like I wanted to come up with a way of like because I could have just inscribed stuff myself, but then it's like, how do
yeah.
I decide what dates are important? Like, how do I decide when to do what? Like,
Mhm.
I wanted the selection of where we made these tethers between Bitcoin time and astronomical time to be decided in like a decentralized way. And
Mhm.
so anyone can participate. Anyone can essentially like, in the free market, just decide that this date is valuable and it's worth inscribing, and then that's how we'll decide to do it.
So
So
how
it's
have
kind of
you?
like yeah. Sorry.
So how where is the auction? I mean, obviously you got a website, but in terms of where you guys are hosting the auction itself, is that
Mhm.
on the Bitcoin network, or what's the
So
setup?
it's really simple. So all it is a partially signed Bitcoin transaction. So when you want to bid on a date, you basically just like sign a Bitcoin transaction that says, I'm willing to pay this amount of Bitcoin for this date. And we collect up, it's literally just a spreadsheet, super, super simple. We collect those up, and then the top 16 um, bids are
Yeah,
automatically like verified at the difficulty adjustment block. So it's an auction that resets every 2 weeks or every 2016 blocks. And literally, like on that block, it's like the top 16 transactions get signed, the transactions from before get rolled over into the next auction, and then it just continues like that. So,
cool.
yeah, it's a really, really simple, like, way of building an auction. And that was also part of why we wanted to do it on a regular time cycle. So it's not like that we're, doing this auction, then we decide, okay, this is high enough. Like now we're going to take that. It's
Yeah,
like Bitcoin decides, like, this is when this time cycle ends and the new cycle begins. And so that also means that like it's really crazy. Like the last 5 blocks of an auction, you just see all these bids come in all at once. And then when you have one block remaining, obviously a Bitcoin block can come at any time. Like it's on average every 10
yeah, yeah,
minutes, but like
yeah.
it could verify at any time. So you see this like weird game of chicken that plays out where people are like, no, I want this one. No, 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 wait, I want the 420. Like, and like you just, yeah, it's a really, really funny like game essentially that we've made.
Yeah, that's
Um,
cool.
yeah,
And what
it's
is the
wild.
life? I mean, the life cycle of this, does it go into perpetuity? I mean, is it something that you could potentially be doing for the next 10 years?
Yeah, I hope so. That's kind of the
Yeah,
goal. I mean, so we inscribe 16 at a time, which means it's the reason why I chose 16 is because it's slightly more than one per day. So we're
yeah,
like catching up a little bit. Um, and yeah, it's kind of so if we wanted to get to 1,000 dates, that takes like around a little over 3 years. So like in three
yeah,
years, we'll have 1,000 dates inscribed. If you wanted to get to like a 10K collection, that's like a common thing for
yeah.
NFTs, that
30
takes a
years,
little less than 25. Yeah, it's like
25.
about 25
Okay.
years. Yeah, so it takes takes a long time to get to kind of like the numbers that I think, I also wanted to build in something that was more long term. I think that's a big problem with a lot of like the NFT mindset and the crypto
Yes.
mindset is it's just this like pump
Mm,
and dump fast cycle. And like I'm trying to get people to think about Bitcoin from like a deep time perspective. Like think about Bitcoin in terms of hundreds of years or thousands of years, and then from that build out your project. And
yeah,
so that's also part of why I'm doing it this way, is just to make it something that has longevity, that like can evolve over time. And it's really interesting to see even like what dates people pick, and how
yeah.
we're
I'm
like
sure.
filling out
Yeah.
we're filling it out, right? I mean, you can literally, I think at this point, you could make an astronomical model of the solar system with the data that we've inscribed, because every single date we inscribe the sun is here, the moon is here, Pluto's here, Mercury's here, Venus is here, whatever. All
Yeah.
of the planetary positions are inscribed with that timestamp, and so you can literally piece that together at this point and like fill out a model of the solar system. And that's what I hope some really crazy PhD student, 4,000 years in the future ends up having to do for their thesis. Just be like, oh my God, like, what is this data? What did they mean by this? Like eventually comes up with like some sort of model for understanding like when Bitcoin happened. That's my goal, is that PhD student thesis, like way in the future.
So for those of you who are listening, you can go and check out ephemera.gallery. Super cool website. Obviously got got the font rights and the rest of it. We'll put it in the description for people to check out. Love the idea. I think it's great that you are thinking about it long term. And I think there's also the fun element to it as well. I mean, I get the greater philosophical approach. I mean, I definitely appreciate it. I definitely am a softie for that kind of stuff. But I think it's also fun, I think there's a lot of relevance here, especially like, a special occasion, like you said, someone's kid, a wedding date, whatever it might be. I think it's super cool that you can do this kind of thing on Bitcoin. Last question before we close off at the top of the hour. Actually, two questions. The first one is, what has been the most significant thing that you've gotten out of this experience with Bitcoin over the last few years?
I think the big thing is hope. I mean, it's an easy answer probably for anyone that's into Bitcoin, but before Bitcoin, I was extremely nihilistic about the future. I was not in like a serious way, but I was like a low key
Yeah.
doomsday prepper. Still am. I think it's good to have it's good to have some water supply like in the backyard. I've got chickens out there. Like I'm ready for some instability. I think some instability is necessary. But I was essentially like banking on the instability, and I was banking on like total collapse.
Yeah.
And I think Bitcoin was the first thing that made me feel really optimistic about the future, particularly like the digital future. There's so much like, oh, social media is doing blah, 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 our attention spans, there's a lot of doom talk about technology and the internet. And I think Bitcoin is an incredibly positive thing that
Mm.
essentially transforms human greed into a trustless network. Like we're all trying to mine these blocks to make money, and that results in a network that's extremely resistant to fraud and is peer to peer. And I think it's incredible, beautiful technology, and it
Mm.
totally changed my life in terms of just willingness to invest myself in building the future rather than just trying to extract myself and like survive. You know what I mean? Like it
Mm.
just it totally changed my life path. Um and that was before ordinals and inscriptions. That was just Bitcoin. And then I feel like ordinals came about and I was just kind of at the right place in the right time. And unsurprisingly, because I'm a Bitcoin astrologer, I'm a very spiritual woo-woo person. And so I kind of thought, okay, this is the path I'm supposed to be on. This is the thing that I'm supposed to do. This is the aspect I can provide to this.
Yeah, well, you
Um,
like good friends with the guy who freaking created it, and you co-host a podcast. I mean, you were in the perfect place at the perfect time. Yeah, I mean, it's cool. Great answer, by the way. Love it. Last question. What are you looking forward to the most, in terms of where you are at in your life and this journey with Bitcoin?
so I think this answer probably won't come as a surprise from everything I've said in this episode, but I think there's a lot left to inscribe that's very important to inscribe. So, like with ephemera, I kind of wanted to start with that time stamping aspect of like, okay, we need to communicate the time in which Bitcoin existed and make sure that that's really clear and that we're logging astronomical data onto Bitcoin. But you could think about Bitcoin as like, it's essentially the Library of Alexandria that can't be burned. It is this like it's this potential to record philosophical documents, to record history, to record art, to record anything that you think is worth preserving. It can be preserved on Bitcoin. And um, it's not necessarily easy, right? Like we have the size constraints of the
Mm.
transactions. And so it's not just as simple as like, taking 100 gigabytes of data and slapping it on the Bitcoin blockchain. I think inscriptions make up like 15 gigabytes of data approximately at this
Yeah.
point. So it's not like an easy challenge necessarily. It takes
Mm.
some intentional work. But that's kind of like, I feel like that's the way that I see my path, and other people, there's other people that get that too. It's not just me that's like inscribing things that have that level of relevancy. The Bible was inscribed extremely early on in ordinals and inscriptions. I think it's like sub 100,000. So there's other people that I think realize this, and I think part of why I want to talk about this, part of why I do this whole Bitcoin is the digital megalith thing, is because like I'm not necessarily the best person to decide what historical events should be recorded on Bitcoin, or what philosophical texts, or whatever. Like I
Yeah,
have
there's
my
so much.
perspective, which is
Yeah, yeah.
more the astronomy side of things, but I want to see what other people do with this kind of way of thinking, this like philosophical mindset towards
Mhm.
Bitcoin. Um, and I'm down to help too. Like that's
Yeah.
the other part. I'm lucky to be connected to the best ordinals devs that exist. And
Mm.
that's why I can build out something like ephemera.gallery. Like I'm not a programmer. I didn't build that website. It's just it takes
Yeah.
a village. It takes a decentralized network of sovereign individuals or whatever to build the digital megalith. So yeah, I think I'm always down to hear what people are working on when they have like ideas like this. And I mean, you can imagine, I get the craziest DMs, but I usually accept them. Like I'll get like such deranged, like I have an idea of how Bitcoin works from a spiritual perspective. And I'm like, all right, let's schedule a call. Like,
That's epic.
so
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I'm excited for that kind of thing. And like, I'm open to like supporting people and just kind of like figuring out how we can push this narrative that's more than just like 10K monkey JPEG images, because I feel like that's like the pre-Renaissance art, when like
Mm.
you're looking at like art where it's like the baby looks like an old man and the perspective is all off, and you're like, why couldn't they just paint and make it look normal? It's like, well, they just didn't have the consciousness hadn't evolved, you needed that Renaissance period. So I feel like the more that I can support that like Bitcoin art renaissance coming into ordinals and inscriptions, like that's my focus for the foreseeable future.
Cool. What a cool thing to look forward to. And now I'm looking forward to it as well. Absolutely. So yeah, let's close it off. I reckon we could chat for another hour, but people will probably switch us off by then. Maybe not, but anyways. Yeah, Erin, thanks for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Great to meet you. Love your vibe. Love what you guys are doing, and long may it continue. And I think I am now going to be watching your pod whenever you guys do it. So I'll smile and wave next time you guys are on. And good luck in Singapore. I was supposed to be there, but unfortunately I had to stay at home. Just a bit of a medical emergency at home, but it seems pretty cool. So I'm glad I stayed. But enjoy the trip, and yeah, good luck.
Thank you. I'll meet you at the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to it. Cool. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Please like and subscribe. It means a lot to us. And yeah, see you on the next episode.
All right, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a like, subscribe, and turn the notification bell on for next time. See ya.